I was asked to kind of begin today by giving an overview, a kind of scene-setting moment of where we are in contemporary architecture and what some of the kind of key challenges are facing the profession. And I thought I could either maybe tell you about a new kilometer-long museum of chocolate in China that undulates its way across this lake like a kind of serpent. Or maybe I could tell you about this chiseled stone and concrete house that nestles in the mountains of Peru. Or perhaps I could tell you about the most exciting public atrium ever conceived in New York, this space that feels like it's been weathered over millennia. Or maybe this new proposal for a pair of towers in New York joined by a kind of floating sky bridge. But then I thought, nah, why would you guys be interested in any of that stuff? When instead, I could talk to you about Belgian suburbia in the 1970s. Yeah, I bet you didn't think you were in for such a thrilling treat today, did you? So why am I interested in Belgian suburbia? This is one of the reasons, this strange house that kind of pops up from behind a hedge with what looks like an army of kind of slithering slugs making their way up the roof tiles. Now, I don't know if any of you can guess what these skylights might be made of. I mean, I couldn't. It turns out they're actually the cockpits reclaimed from these redundant aircraft that were found in a field the other side of Flanders in the 1970s and repurposed by this guy, Marcel Rayers, which is a name I'm ashamed to say I hadn't heard of until about a month ago. I don't know if any of you guys had. Who was a prolific kind of self-taught outsider architect in Belgium between the 1960s to the 1990s. He's still around, he's aged 91. And he became the kind of king of architectural salvage. Built over 100 homes throughout the region of Limburg and beyond, all using entirely reclaimed and salvaged components, whether it was the cockpits from redundant aircraft or kind of roof tiles or bricks or bits of old ships. And he used to kind of collage them together into this style that became known as ad hoc Baroque. He built himself a very kind of elaborate repository of all these bits. This was during a time of intense modernization in Belgium. So it was after the 1958 World's Exhibition, and there was kind of mass bulldozing of historic churches and monasteries and grand houses to build the kind of new era of modernity. And so this guy drove around the country looking for demolition sites and basically stockpiling this incredible range of bits and bobs. And he had a really interesting business model, which is if you came to his salvage yard and bought enough of these fragments, his design services would actually come for free. So it was in his interests to kind of upsell you, a fountain, a fireplace, a pair of doors from a stately home. And before you knew it, you would have accidentally employed an architect to kind of build your dream home. And I mean, the products of this process are just incredible. I mean, to my eye, this is a house he built that had the kind of triumphal entrance from an old military barracks, kind of crashing into other bits that were salvaged from an old slaughterhouse. This is the house under construction. He would often actually get his clients involved in the process. So the family that had commissioned this house, they actually helped to dismantle the old slaughterhouse kind of brick by brick and piece it back together. This is another house nearby where a grand bay window from a townhouse in Brussels is kind of hanging on the side of a modernist brick house like an oversized trophy about to fall off. He really enjoyed these juxtapositions of different scales. This is part of an old, I think, pulpit, kind of bolted onto these. Again, a lot of the boulders came from nearby rivers, so as well as salvaging bits from condemned buildings, he would kind of go around the landscape, kind of gathering whatever he could find. For this project, he used part of a nave from a demolished church to build, again, a kind of triumphal entrance to this strange cottage that looks like something from a Miyazaki animation. And the interiors were just as mad. And I mean, he took great joy in the fact that the bits often didn't quite meet up. So in this case, the staircase was too short to join this floor and the floor above. So rather than try and hide the fact, he built this kind of mound, this like momentous mound out of cobbles and like bits of old marble to kind of actually emphasize and celebrate and kind of glorify the slightly Frankenstein nature of the project. This is another interior where this incredible sculptural fireplace actually came from steel from an old shipyard. The beams, again, were like tarred pine from a ship. This is inside his own, as part of his kind of salvage yard office complex, he also had his own bar and restaurant where he would seduce you. You'd maybe start with a little cocktail at this bar under chandelier salvaged from a Brussels hotel, and then maybe he'd invite you to one of the banquettes. And before you knew it, you were ushered through the mirrored door into the kind of secret restaurant behind where he would wine and dine you. And if you were maybe one of the super, super lucky clients, you'd be invited up to the boudoir where the design conversation would continue. Maybe it would even continue in the bathtub, who knows? Which again was conceived like a kind of Roman throne. And it was funny, he built his own apartment out of all the bits that he couldn't sell. So it was all the things that were slightly too strange or extreme for clients to want to buy. And there he is. I mean, how could you say no to this guy? So why am I telling you about this? Is this a kind of urgent issue facing architects today? I mean, I think it is. And the reason I'm interested in him, this Belgian group called Rotor recently kind of uncovered him and created this book and exhibition at De Single in Antwerp. And their argument is that now, given the kind of age of scarcity, we should really be treating existing buildings almost like quarries or kind of mines of materials, quarries of components. And actually taking pleasure and joy and kind of mischief in the reassembling of those bits. So rather than it being a kind of hair shirt, we're just doing it for saving the planet, it can actually become a kind of style all of its own. This is what happens most of the time. This is Robin Hood Gardens in London, which was a pioneering council estate built in the 1960s by Alison and Peter Smithson. Great campaigns were launched to save it. People like Richard Rogers coming out saying it's one of the most important housing projects of its era. It would have been eminently possible to do a retrofit, add insulation and change the windows, make it probably some of the most desirable council housing in London. Instead, this is what happened. That was it when it was first built. It was a kind of model of stacking maisonettes and having these interlocking scissor sections, streets in the sky. And this is what's replaced it, which, let's be honest, that could be in Auckland, couldn't it? Could be anywhere. And as you'll see, now mostly for sale, not social housing. I mean, this is a story that's happening all across the world, as you well know. And now, strangely, a piece of it was actually salvaged in a kind of Rijmakers-esque way, but rather than being used to maybe create more social housing or being used for a new project, it was actually acquired by the Victoria and Albert Museum as a kind of relic of the days when we once built council housing, which, I mean, tells you everything. Social housing now is seen as something that belongs in a museum. This was when it was exhibited at the Venice Biennale in this kind of triumphal showcase of, what we once did as a nation. But yeah, this is where most architecture ends up, sadly. I think, 30% of all waste on the planet is construction waste. And when buildings are designed with a lifespan of around 40 years, with interiors endlessly stripped out, and kind of, especially office space and retail space, has a lifespan of even less. And this is where most of it ends up. If it doesn't end up in landfill, then it's recycled. And as you all know, recycling, conventionally in the construction trade, doesn't mean recycling at all. It means downcycling. It means taking actually very valuable, useful pieces of the built environment and degrading them, turning them into aggregates, basically, and hardcore to be used for much kind of lower cost uses. But there is another way. So I'm going to just run through a few projects that show an alternative. This is the Philips Tower in Brussels, built in the 1960s. That was one of those classic pieces of modernist urban planning, hated for generations. There were campaigns to bulldoze it. Again, Rotor came up with an alternative, working with Conics architects. They did this kind of thorough analysis of every piece of the building, from the aluminium window profiles to the stone slabs in the plaza. And they created this kind of, what they called an approach of urban forestry, where the wood isn't from living trees, but it's harvested from the condemned building. So they very carefully dismantled this building piece by piece, kept all the elements, added a new facade to create some more floor area with this kind of lightweight prefabricated system. and then refitted the components in different ways. So here you've got the aluminium H profiles from the tower's original facade being used to create a new chandelier in the lobby. Blue stone blocks that were dismantled from the rear facade and reused to create a new floor on the plinth in the atrium. They brought stone from another dismantled square in Bruges to create more floor area. So like every piece of the building, and a bit like I'm nose to tail eating. This is like basement to roof architectural salvage where no bit went wasted. They wanted to kind of turn this into a bigger project, so they started mapping every architectural salvage and deconstruction practice in Europe. This is kind of a screenshot from the early stage of that project. Found 300 companies in the Benelux region, 600 in France, 600 in the UK as well, not shown on this map. And Brussels has even introduced new legislation to make all public buildings follow kind of circular construction principles by 2030. So momentum is really building for this to be an alternative. And it's taking off. This is a project in London, in Canada Water, by Jan Katijn. It's called Paper Gardens. It's a new home for a local charity that runs creative ecology workshops for school groups and families. It occupies an industrial printing shed that was once used to print the Daily Mail. Shock horror. 60% of this project is either reused or reclaimed, and it costs just £200,000, which I guess is about 400,000 New Zealand dollars. So it's got walls made of stacked logs from trees that were being felled anyway nearby that have been bound with lime mortar, oak railway sleepers used for the corner coins, windows that were sourced from rejected stock. A similar thing was happening in Copenhagen, where the Carlsberg brewery and a local Steiner school were being demolished. But as you guys probably know, the modern cement mortar actually makes it very difficult to separate bricks and reuse them as bricks. And so what they decided to do was take an angle grinder to the building, slice up the facade in these blocks, and then kind of piece them back together as cladding modules. So this is a housing project, again, another affordable housing project done by an architect, developer, and builder team called Lendager, where they've built 100 homes using this kind of picturesque patchwork of reclaimed bricks. And they've estimated that that uses 60% less carbon than conventional construction. And interestingly, because they're designing, producing, and delivering the materials, they're in complete control of the kind of economics of the process. So they're not subject to the kinds of builders who would say, oh, well, if you're reusing materials, it's going to cost you 20% more. They know that it doesn't, and that actually it's a lot cheaper and more environmentally friendly. And you can have fun with the details as well with these projects. This is a new social centre called The Moorings in Thamesmead in East London, which again was a very kind of rundown council estate and is currently being revived. The old parquet floor from the 1960s community centre had been, destroyed over time. Rather than patch it up with pieces of parquet, the artist Verity Jane Keefe developed a new kind of wood chip terrazzo where she took bits of the condemned floorboards and kind of pulverized them into these little pieces and combined it with a green resin. And so it's kind of a bit like the way, they have the Japanese art of kintsugi, where they repair ceramics and actually highlight the cracks with gold. It's like celebrating the fact that this building has been repaired and that care has been taken over the existing fabric, and actually turning that act of care and repair into a feature. And one of my favorite parts of this building is that each of those moments of repair has been documented, a bit like going to a gallery. There's a little museum label that tells you, this used to be the surface of the bar that's now been reclaimed and turned into the kind of cafe counter. This is a project that a lot of you are probably familiar with, so I might run through it quickly, but the conversion of the Grand Parc council estate in Bordeaux by Lacaton and Vassal, who I believe spoke to you in one of your previous conferences. Again, a 1960s council estate on the edge of Bordeaux. This was at a time when the French government was allocating 167,000 euros for demolishing each apartment and rebuilding a new one. Lacaton and Vassal, working with Frédéric Dureau, argued that actually it was possible to redesign, expand, and upgrade 3 flats for that cost. And that's exactly what they did. They added a new, 3-meter deep facade, a 4-meter deep clip-on prefabricated facade, doubling the size of the units in some cases, adding these winter gardens, increasing thermal performance, and actually kind of crucially transforming the image of the place and allowing residents to stay in residence during the whole process of construction. And then they went on to win the EU Mies Prize in 2019, the first time a refurbishment project had won such a kind of glamorous award. So, I mean, the tide really is turning towards retrofit as the first choice. This is another project back in Brussels. I think Belgium is really the epicenter of this kind of work at the moment, partly because of local government regulations. This is the World Trade Center, built in 1972. Again, one of those kind of hated projects by the public that had become to symbolize all of the kind of worst things about architects being these kind of godlike city planners. And then there was a big campaign to demolish it once again. But the practice called 514NE wrote this manifesto called How Not to Demolish a Building, which I would say is essential reading. Their approach was, to strip it back, keep the existing structure of the two towers, and actually do this quite radical thing, which is to build a massive new slab in between the two towers, where each floor of the new slab would be twice the height of the previous towers. So you'd have this strange kind of stepped section where every other floor was a double height space, kind of 5 meters high, and then you would go into the original lower level towers. It's now home, or will be home when it's finished, to new Flemish government offices, which has these floor areas that are kind of 110 meters long by 22 meters deep. But because they're 5 meters high, they still have a lot of kind of light and air, and the end of each floor plate will end in this kind of open air terrace. And again, this project used 63% of the original building. I wanted to come on to London and to the kind of client that maybe you wouldn't expect to be following this approach. This is the London School of Economics, which recently in the UK has become one of the most kind of sought after clients because of the kinds of projects they commission and the kinds of competitions they launch. This was the new student centre by O'Donnell and Toomey, a kind of twisting brick and concrete ziggurat. Then they commissioned this great glass and steel tower by Rogers Stirk Harbour. After that came the Grafton Marshall building, which has been showered with prizes, and again, as a kind of monument to concrete and to the carbon age. So it was really surprising when, for their latest competition, they said, this is our site, this kind of 1950s neo-Georgian pastiche block on Lincoln's Inn Fields. And it's up to you, global starchitecture shortlist, whether you demolish this building and build another signature to add to our collection of very impressive architectural signatures, or whether to keep the building and do a retrofit. And so David Chipperfield won the project, and the reason he won is because he actually proposed to keep as much of the existing building as possible. And he'd set himself this insane kind of personal challenge of meeting Passive House, WELL certification, and BREEAM Outstanding, which has never been done before, taking the three kind of global benchmarks of best practice, all of which contradict each other, and trying to actually meet every single target in this one project is a kind of perverse, challenge to his office. And it's obviously been a nightmare for people actually working on this project, but they are somehow managing to achieve it. So it will retain, again, 60% of the existing building. It adds a 2-story lightweight timber roof extension. But the really interesting thing about this, to me, is it's become a battleground between sustainability and heritage. And so historic England, kind of custodians of decorum on the street, have actually come out and said this building is harmful. And the reason it's harmful is because of the visual dominance and encroachment on the historic streetscape caused by the projection and extension of the building's upper portion. I mean, if you zoomed out and looked at that elevation, no building has the same roofline anyway. So, I mean, it's become this kind of stalemate of actually who's going to win. Will it be the heritage lobby or the environmental lobby? So that's definitely one to follow. Okay, zooming to the south of France. This is a building that will make for great architectural salvage in a few years' time when it's dismantled, when it's proved to be completely redundant. So it's the kind of swan song of Frank Gehry, the last of the kind of crumpled metal blobs. I don't know if any of you have been, but it's an incredibly confusing labyrinth of circulation and kind of redundant foyers and balconies full of tourists actually trying to find the art. And then they realize that this tower is an office tower, and it's full of back-of-house space that's inaccessible to the public. And they finally reach the top, which is this very kind of underwhelming viewing platform, and they're told, oh no, the galleries are in the basement. So having done this great architectural promenade, you're kind of sent back down to the bottom. But the reason the Illuma Foundation is interesting is because across the park from this great kind of architectural totem, there's a very low-key project, which is an old train shed that has been reborn by a London practice, Assemble, working with BC architects, again from Brussels, the world center of this kind of work, which is a kind of testing ground for this new kind of bioregional architecture. So they set a brief where all of the materials had to come from a particular, like within a certain radius of the project. And so they've created new walls using a kind of rammed rubble construction. So this is a mixture of demolition rubble from the site mixed with waste stone dust from a local quarry to create, what all architects would dream of, this kind of porcelain white concrete effect. But it's all made from waste materials. They've used broken roof tiles to create this kind of terrazzo pattern in the floor. The acoustic insulation on the walls comes from sunflower pulp, which again is another of the biggest agricultural waste byproducts in the Camargue region. They have kind of workshops there looking at everything, how to make tiles out of the waste clay that comes from the local quarry. Let me just get this right. The local quarry produces 5,000 tons of waste clay each year that can be turned into these architectural ceramics. That's some more experiments using the sunflower pith to create thermal insulation. So the walls have been sprayed with a mixture of the sunflower pulp to create not only acoustic but thermal insulation. And they're even using salt, because the region has these kind of salt marshes, and they're growing door handles out of salt, which have this kind of antibacterial property. So in an age when we're so paranoid about touching everything, this is a kind of antibacterial door handle made from the local salt. It's just another example of this kind of new bioregional approach, which is turning trash into treasure and actually looking at waste streams and how they can actually be turned into very useful, productive, and quite beautiful things. I can see that I'm running out of time, so I'm going to whiz through this. Just a brief bit about what has been called in the UK the new Stone Age, using stone as a structural material finally, rather than as a kind of paper-thin cladding. Again, I think you had Amin Taha talk to you at one of your previous conferences, but this is his Clerkenwell Close project, which uses load-bearing blocks of Portland stone to hold up this office and apartment building. He claims that it uses 70% less carbon than a steel frame and 60% less than a concrete frame. And he has this argument that currently we crush and burn and chemically mix our limestone to make cement and concrete that then has 40% of the strength of its original form. And then it also needs steel to reinforce it, which is an incredibly energy-intensive process to create that steel. So he describes our current situation as being like processed food. It's cheap and has bad side effects. So why not go back to the original source and use stone in its load-bearing capacity? He's actually currently under construction on a 10-story apartment tower in Finchley, North London, made of volcanic stone, which here is actually imported from Mount Etna in Sicily, which might raise some eyebrows about the carbon footprint of that. But they did fire tests and realized that the basalt exoskeleton required roughly half the amount of stone as a limestone one, and costs about 25% less than actually cladding a steel or concrete frame. I mean, that could be an interesting precedent for you guys, given that you're sitting literally on mountains of lava. Maybe there could be a new basalt Stone Age. Maybe it's already happening, in which case, please come and tell me about it. He's even proposed a 30-story load-bearing stone tower, and this has been structurally proven with engineers that it's eminently possible. Elsewhere in the world, stone is, it's not a luxury material. This is cheaper than using concrete and steel in most cases. This is social housing in Mallorca, built by the IBAVI, the Balearic Housing Institute, which uses 60% less carbon compared to conventional construction. And here, obviously, it serves the purpose of having that thermal mass to keep the homes cool, helps to regulate humidity. In this case, the insulation is made from local seagrass as well, following the kind of bioregional principles. And the construction cost, in this case, is less than 150,000 euros per home. I'm going to end with this, which is coming back to Lacaton and Vassal, who were once approached to redesign a public square in Bordeaux as part of an urban embellishment program. And I think they couldn't have picked worse architects if they wanted embellishment, because that's not what Lacaton and Vassal do. And so their response was quite unusual. They told the client to leave it alone. They said this square actually works really well. People enjoy sitting on these benches. They enjoy sitting under the trees. It's really kind of lively in the evenings. And so this is what their kind of philosophy boiled down to is this project. Is when you go to the doctor, they might tell you that you're fine, that you actually don't need medicine, and that architecture should be the same. Sometimes the answer is to do nothing. And I'll leave it there. Thank you.